Hi, this is Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm going to show you how to do yarn over short row sock heels, like the ones I've used here in my Azalea socks. And the nice thing about short row sock heels is that they're worked exactly the same whether you are working from the toe up to the top of your sock or from the leg down to the toe of your sock. For my example, I'm actually working my sock today from the leg down. So the basic idea of short row heels, and this is true of all short row heels, not just the yarn over kind, is that you start your heel by working across half of your sock stitches. So for example, if my sock was 60 stitches all the way around, I'm going to start my heel just across 30 of those stitches, working back and forth in rows. And as you're working the heel back and forth in rows, you're going to work one less stitch in each row back and forth, and you're going to put a special turning stitch on the end of each row. So gradually you're going to get this nice tapered shape of the heel, and you're going to eventually have about a third of your stitches on each side being turning stitches, and about a third of the stitches at the center just being regular stitches. And your pattern should tell you how many stitches on each side should be the turning stitches. Once you get up to this last short row, it's time to start shaping on the other side of the heel. What happens there is that you're going to gradually work one extra stitch on each side of the heel until you get back to your normal number of stitches that you had. So in this case, it would be 30. So most short row sock heel tutorials are broken up into two parts. The first part would be where the rows are getting shorter, and the second part is the shaping where the rows are getting longer. And I'm actually going to do this video all in one big chunk. So if you would like to skip ahead just to the part where the rows are getting longer, look right up here and you can fast forward the video here to that time. So let me grab my yarn and needles and we'll get started on the first part of the shaping. As you get started with your short row heel, it makes things easier if you divide your stitches so that half your sock stitches, which are the heel stitches, are on a single needle, and then half your sock stitches they can either be held on a stitch holder, or you could put them on a couple spare double pointed needles, or you could even hold them on a piece of waste yarn, because you're not going to do anything with these stitches on the top of your foot for right now. So to get started, you simply knit across until you're one stitch before the end of this first row. So I have 32 stitches in my first row of socks here, so I'm going to knit across all but the last one, and I'll meet you when I get to the other side. So I'm almost done with the first row, and you'll notice I'm going to stop here when one stitch remains on my left needle. And instead of working that stitch, I'm actually going to turn my work over so that the other side is facing. So now I need to do my turning stitch. And the turning stitch you need to make when the wrong side of your work is facing is called a reverse yarn over. So for a regular yarn over, you bring your yarn forward between the needles and over. For a reverse yarn over, you actually bring your work back behind your needles between them and then over. And then I'm going to purl the next stitch. And you'll notice that here between the stitch that I skipped at the end and the yarn over I made, there's actually a pretty sizable gap. And that's okay. That's exactly what you want to happen. And that gap is kind of going to be a marker that we're going to look for later on. So now as I continue up the second row of the sock heel, I'm just going to purl all the way across until one stitch remains. So I've purled across all the stitches in the second row of my heel, and now one stitch remains on my left needle. So now I'm going to turn my work over And again, you need to make a turning stitch every time you turn. And in this case, my turning stitch is just going to be a yarn over. So I need to bring my yarn forward between my needles and then over the right hand needles. And then for this row, I will continue knitting all the way across the row. And I'm going to stop right there for a minute, because you'll notice again that between that last stitch that I made and the yarn over, again, there's a fairly sizable gap right there. And those gaps are going to be landmarks that we're looking for as we work the rest of our heel. So I'm going to knit across the rest of this row, and I'm going to stop 2 stitches before the gap on the other side. So I have knit across my row, and I'm going to stop here 2 stitches before the gap. And again, you can see that landmark gap, and then there's 2 stitches on my left needle. So now I'm going to turn my work. I need to make a turning stitch, which when the wrong side of your work is facing, it's a reverse yarn over. So you bring your yarn to the back between your needles and then over the top. And then you're going to purl across again until you get to 2 stitches before the gap. And now I'll stop right there. You can see I've made another gap. Again, it happens between these 2 stitches and the yarn over. So I'm going to purl across now and finish up this 4th row. And I'm going to purl across until I get 2 stitches before the next gap. So I've purled across my row. And I'm going to stop here 2 stitches before the gap. Turn my work. I'm going to make my turning stitch, which is a regular yarn over when the right side is facing. So bring my yarn forward between my needles and over my right hand needle. And then knit across the rest of the row. And as you can see, another gap has formed here between this pair and my yarn over. So that's our landmark that we'll be looking for. So as you continue with the first half of your short row heel, you're going to continue in the same process. You'll work across until you get 2 stitches before a gap, turn your work, do a yarn over or reverse yarn over depending on which side you're on, work across the other direction until you get 2 stitches before the gap, turn your work again, do your yarn over or your reverse yarn over, and you'll keep going until your heel is the desired length. So for the heel that I'm working, I'm actually going to end up with 11 gaps on the left hand side of my heel and 10 gaps on the right hand side of my heel. And then it will be time for me to start shaping in the other direction on the second part of the heel. So I'm going to knit that up right now, and then I'll meet you when I'm ready to start the second half of the heel. So I'm just finishing up the last row of the first half of my heel, and it's a wrong side row. I'm stopping 2 stitches before the gap and turning my work. And you can see all my gaps here on the right hand side of the heel. And I actually have, there's 1 less gap on this side than there is on the other side of the sock heel at this point, because I haven't worked that last turning stitch yet, which I'll do here in just a minute. So for the second half of the heel, we need to close up these gaps. So I'm going to make my turning stitch by bringing my yarn forward and over the right hand needle. And then I'm going to knit across until I get to 1 stitch before the gap. And there's my gap, and then 1 stitch before. So I need to close up this gap, and the gaps are closed by working the stitch before the gap and the stitch after the gap together, and that's true on both sides, but it's done a little bit differently on the right side and the wrong side. So on the right side of your work, to close that gap, you're going to slip 1 stitch, which is your yarn over. You're going to slip that stitch from the left needle to the right without twisting it. And then the second stitch you're going to slip knitwise, so it actually twists the stitch. And then you're going to knit those 2 stitches together through the back loops. Whoops, my yarn split there. So you knit those 2 together through the back loop. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to show you a quick little trick. Sometimes when I am working this type of heel, I have a tough time finding this next gap when I get back to it. So I like to just stick a little stitch marker right around there so that it's easy for me to find when I get back to that point. So now turn your work. And instead of making a turning stitch, this time we're just going to slip that first stitch. And then we're going to purl across until we get 1 stitch before the gap. And there I am, 1 stitch before the gap. And again, we have to work these 2 stitches together to close up that gap. On the purl side, it's really easy to do. You just purl the 2 stitches together. There's no need to slip them or do them through the back loops. And again, there's my next gap. To make it easier to find it when I come back to this side, I'm going to just put another stitch marker and just hang it there on my needle in between so that I can easily find it. So now you repeat the same process row after row. You're going to slip the first stitch. You're going to knit across your needles until you get to 1 stitch before the gap. Or in my case, since I put a marker where the gap is, I'm going to knit to 1 stitch before that marker. So I'm 1 stitch before the gap. I need to close the gap, so I'm going to remove the marker. I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise without twisting it, the second stitch knitwise, and then I'm going to knit those 2 stitches together through the back loops. And again, now I'm 1 stitch before the next gap, and I'm going to stick my marker there in that gap again just to make it easy to find. Turn your work, slip the first stitch, purl across until you get 1 stitch before the next gap or 1 stitch before the marker. And remove the marker so it's out of the way. And we're going to close the gap again by working 2 stitches together. And on the purl side, that just means that you are going to purl 2 stitches together. Oop, I got caught in the marker there. Purl 2 stitches together. Again, to make it easier to find that gap later, I'll hang my stitch marker there. And then continue on. You slip the first stitch, work to 1 stitch before the gap, close up the gap, turn your work, slip 1 stitch, knit to 1 stitch before the gap, and close up the gap and turn your work. And you're going to continue doing that until you have 1 gap left on each side of the sock. So I'm going to knit to that point and then I'll show you what happens next. So I'm just finishing up the last wrong side row of the heel. I've reached 1 stitch before the gap. I'm going to take off my marker. I'm going to close up that gap by purling 2 stitches together. And then I'm going to put my marker back onto my needle. And so I have 1 gap left on this side. I'm going to turn my work. And you can see I also only have 1 gap left on the other side. And at this point, I'm going to begin working in rounds again instead of rows for the rest of the sock. So if you need to, if these stitches across the top of the foot were held on a stitch holder or piece of waste yarn, you'll need to put those back onto your needles. So there's 2 more rounds that are still considered part of the heel as we close up these last 2 gaps. So for the first round, we're going to slip that first stitch just like we have been, and we're going to knit across all the way until we get to 1 stitch before the gap. So I have knit across until I'm 1 stitch before the gap. I'm going to remove that stitch marker because I'm not going to need it anymore because the last gap on that side will be closed. I'm going to close that gap by slipping 1 stitch, slipping 1 stitch knitwise, and then knitting through the back loops. And then I'm going to go ahead and start knitting across the top of the foot. So now I'm at the end of the first round, and I've just finished knitting across the top of the foot. And then as I turn so that I can begin my next round, you'll remember that we still have 1 gap here that we need to close up. So as we start the last round of the heel here, all we need to do to close up that gap this time is we're just going to take those 2 stitches and we are going to knit those 2 stitches together to close the gap. And then you can just continue working in rounds for the foot of your sock until you get down to the toe and need to do your toe shaping. So now we're done with the second round of the heel. And let me pop things all out here so you can see what it looks like. So this is the leg of my sock up here, and I'm just doing shorty socks for these. And then my yarn over short row heel. And now I'm ready to continue working in rounds for the foot of my sock and then the toe at the end. So I hope you enjoyed learning how to make a yarn over short row heel. And if you did, and you'd like to try this in a pattern, you can head over to thechilidog.com and look for the shop section, and there you'll be able to find my Azalea socks, which uses the yarn over short row heel, and spoiler alert, it also uses the same method to do a yarn over short row toe. Until next time, happy knitting!